And so just to tell you a little bit about Jemaah Islamiyah, this was for a long time the largest terrorist organisation in Southeast Asia. At its height, it probably had around about 2,000 members, with probably 1,000 to 2,000 more people undergoing a rather long and arduous induction process. It was also the only transnational, genuinely transnational terrorism group in Southeast Asia. It was founded in 1993, and it continued to grow in a quite consistent way until the Bali bombing of 2002, and then large numbers of JI leaders and members were arrested, jailed, some of them executed or shot by the police in the process of apprehension. And so JI's high point was very short-lived, and it was really that terrorist attack of 2002 that exposed the organisation and led to its near decline. It functions, but on a much reduced scale to what it used to function. In some terrorist literature, the impression is given that JI is in fact something new in Indonesian jihadism, and that Indonesian Islam was previously quite moderate, and it's only because of this influence from the Middle East and groups like Al-Qaeda that we see this extreme radicalisation. This is not at all correct. Indeed, one of the oldest jihadist organisations in the world is Darul Islam, and you can see from this rather confusing table in front of you that it was established around about 1948. And the Darul Islam movement presented the most serious threat to the central government of Indonesia throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. JI itself is an offshoot of Darul Islam, and another group which undertook most of the big bombings from 2003 to 2009 was the Northern Network, led by Northern Muhammad Top. And that network split away from JI when the JI leadership tried to stop more bombings after the Bali bombing. So you can see that there is not quite an evolutionary, but there is a dynamic process taking place as these terrorist groups form and split and adapt to these new circumstances. The closing section of this talk, and I'll only go for a few more minutes, I wanted to give you an indication of just how much more complex terrorism has become in Indonesia. So you see the faces of two men in front of you. One of them is Abu Bakar Bashir. I'm sure most people would be familiar with his face. He was the Amir of JI, the head of JI, from 1999 through to his arrest in 2002 after the Bali bombing. The other person is not very well known, and his name doesn't even sound like the name of a terrorist, Pepe Fernando. So Abu Bakar Bashir, everything about his life suggests that there's a high probability that he would become a very radicalised figure. He had always been strongly, trenchantly in favour of the application of Sharia law. He'd always taken very strong positions against what he saw as secularism in Indonesia, and he had been prosecuted in some ways unfairly by the state in the early 1980s, and it's one of the things that began him on the path that eventually led him and his good friend Abdullah Sunkar to found Jemaah Islamiyah in 1993. So the thing about Abu Bakar Bashir is that there is a consistency to the trajectory of his life. The nature of his thinking hasn't changed a great deal throughout that period, and he's now in his early 70s. He's currently, in fact, in jail serving a 15-year term for involvement in the Aceh terrorist group, so he may well die in prison. The other person, Pepe Fernando, is a good example of the new type of terrorist that we find in Indonesia. He, in actual fact, came from quite a cosmopolitan, liberal background. He went to the Jakarta State Islamic University, Sharif Hidayatullah, and he studied theology. This is usually a field in which people have quite expansive thinking. They're not rigid thinkers at all. He had a strong Islamic education. When he graduated, he moved into the entertainment industry. He wrote for entertainment magazines. He wrote scripts for soap operas. He had a very wide circle of friends, including Christians and Buddhists. So there was nothing in Pepe's background that suggested that he might become an extremist. But that's exactly what he did around about 5 years ago. He joined the local cell of Darul Islam, that group I mentioned that was formed in the late 1940s. He quickly became too radical for the other members in that group because he wanted to start putting together bombs and the like. So he was ostracized, he left, he set up his own terrorist group, and he planned terrorist attacks against the Indonesian president and also against Catholic churches, and he sent book bombs to another number of prominent Indonesians. He was captured and he's now serving a jail terrorist acts. So on the one hand, we have Abu Bakr Bashir, who has long been involved in radical organisations and has very long standing in the jihadist community. And on the other hand, we have these Johnny-come-late leaks like Pepe Fernando. Now, if you were a counter-terrorist police officer, it wouldn't be too hard to do a profile on Abu Bakr Bashir and say someone like this is at high risk of being drawn into these kind of groups. But if you did a profile based on what we knew about Pepe Fernando, he would almost certainly confound the normal profile setting we would have for a prospective terrorist. And this is one of the problems, the rapidly changing face of terrorism in Indonesia. We are seeing new people joining terrorist groups who seem to have no history of radicalism in their family or in their personal life, but they become, in fact, very militant and very quickly, often using the internet both to become radicalised and then to gain some of the skills that they use in undertaking terrorist actions. And there are a great many people like Pepe Fernando in Indonesia. We just don't hear much of them unless they're arrested. Slide, I wanted to just give a brief summary of what I've been talking about. So hopefully I've given you some idea about what a contentious field of studies terrorism is, about the importance of examining one's own position, one's own assumption, one's own cultural orientation when you're beginning to study why terrorists do what they do. In general, Indonesian terrorism is becoming increasingly diffuse and fragmented, and that poses a problem for the police and for the intelligence agencies because it's becoming increasingly hard to keep track of all these new groups that are emerging and understanding why they're emerging. Increasingly now, networks are much more important than organisations. And we can expect that there's going to be a constant proliferation of new types of groups. They mightn't be able to undertake the kind of big attacks that we saw in 2002 in Bali, but nonetheless, they want to kill people, and they've certainly killed a lot of police in the last few years. And it might be that they turn their attention back to Westerners, depending on how their attitudes to the main enemy is. Two final things to say. Indonesia is likely to have a terrorism threat for decades because the kinds of root factors that are leading to the emergence of these terrorist groups are going to continue to be present for that time. There are going to continue to be a small number of people in the community who are attracted to the notion that only through violence can we achieve glories for Islam that will otherwise not be achievable if we're using peaceful means. So we should regard terrorism as a very unfortunate part of Indonesian life. And the last point is that the conflict in Syria And Iraq, the establishment of a caliphate by ISIS or the Islamic State, is likely to have a galvanizing effect on would-be jihadists in Indonesia, because it's relatively easy for Indonesian jihadists to get to those sites. Indeed, probably around about 100 people have already made that trip and are now being trained, are being blooded in battle, and it's very likely that some of those people will return to Indonesia and perhaps engage in a much more violent form of jihad than we've seen in Indonesia for the last 5 years. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I'm happy, if you have any questions, for you to direct emails to me or to come and see me, and I hope it's been informative for you. Thank you very much.